Today I conclude my series of stouts with the strongest style of all of them, that is foreign extra stout. And I'm not only going to serve this beer in a keg, but I'm going to ferment in it as well. I'm Martin Keane, taking the Homebrew Challenge to brew 99 beers in 99 weeks, and last week I brewed a tropical stout, which really emphasized the sweet and fruity flavors of that beer style. This week's stout is quite different from that, in that it's based much more on a typical Irish stout, just stronger. So we're really looking to emphasize the dry and roasty characteristics of this beer. Now this is a relatively strong beer, as I've alluded to, so we're looking for an original gravity here of 1068, which should give us a beer around 7.2%. So we're not quite in the range of some American imperial stouts, but we're certainly getting up there. So to build this beer, we are going to use the base malt of Maris Otter at 72% of the grist. In addition to that, we're going to add 7% of Crystal 45 and 7% of Flaked Barley, which will give us that creamy mouthfeel that's so important to this style. Then we need to address the roasty aspects of this beer, so the way we'll get that is with 4% Roasted Barley, 4% Crystal 120 and 4% Pale Chocolate Malt. And then we're going to add an additional 2% of black patent malt. Now I'm mashing at my usual temperature, 67 Celsius or 152 Fahrenheit. As for how long to mash, these days I typically don't mash more than about 40 minutes, and that's normally enough time for conversion. But I have found that with these higher gravity beers, a bit more time in the mash is sometimes required. So I think it's worth checking your pre-boil gravity before proceeding past the mash. So I'm going to check my pre-boil gravity, which for my system is going to be 1054. When I reach that, then I'll know it's time to move on to the boil. Now, fermenting in a keg is one of the things I've really been looking forward to trying. The basic idea is you just take a regular old corny keg, you probably have some lying around already, and you use it as your fermentation vessel. So you put the wort in here and then you ferment. Then you can either actually serve directly from this keg as well, or you can transfer into a serving keg, which is what I'm going to do. Now, the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to use a shortened dip tube. So if you think about how this is going to work, there's going to be trube at the bottom of this keg when fermentation is done, and I don't want that trube to transfer into my serving keg. And the way I'm going to get around that is to shorten this dip tube. So actually I've got a second dip tube here, which I used for some other purposes. And actually I've already shortened it. I took a Dremel to it and just cut off the last inch or a couple of centimeters from it. So now when this is inserted into the keg, it's just going to be raised up a little bit higher, and it hopefully won't pull in any beer from that trube layer. Now there is one obvious disadvantage to fermenting in a keg, and that relates to volume. So this is a 5-gallon corny keg, but you can't ferment 5-gallon batches in a 5-gallon keg. If you think about it, you've got the trube on the bottom, you need a bit of headspace as well. So probably the most amount of beer you can ferment in a 5-gallon corny keg is about 4.5 gallons. Now, that's not an issue to me because I'm typically brewing 2.5-gallon batches anyway. But there are a ton of advantages to using a corny keg to ferment. and I'm hoping to demonstrate 3 of them today. So I'm going to try and experiment with no chill brewing, pressure fermentation, and fully closed transfers. So let's put this keg to the test. Now, a big beer needs a good hop backbone to support it, so we're going to look at building a IBU of 52 for this beer. For the bittering hops, I'm using a combination of Target and Willamette. So I'm throwing in 1 bag of Target for a 5-gallon batch. That is going to contribute to about 39 IBU. And the Willamette, I'm going to put in half a bag of that, and that will contribute about another 10 IBU. And then I'm going to use the other half of the Willamette bag as my flavor hop, which I'm going to add in with 10 minutes to go in the boil.
I pinned that luck up on falling stars, set my love up in total cards. Next time I'll get it right. Remember last December when we braved through.
Now, making sure everything is clean and sanitized is more important than ever when you're fermenting in a keg. So it's worth really taking the keg apart and then soaking everything in PBW and also sanitizing everything in the keg with Star San. And you might even use some keg lube to make sure that everything is properly sealed and will hold pressure.
Some kind of home. I tell myself it doesn't matter anymore. I was just some kid picking candy off the floor. And next time.
Well, it sure was nice to skip the cooling step. Although perhaps defer the cooling step is more appropriate because I have some hot wort sat in this keg right here, just cooling down. I'm just going to leave it right there while I clean my brewing equipment. Then I'm going to put it in my chest freezer, which is set to just a few degrees above freezing to let it chill. And when it's cooled down to around 68 Fahrenheit or 20 Celsius, I'm going to come back and add the yeast. Well, it's the next morning now. I did underestimate a little bit quite the impact of going from boiling down to yeast pitching temperatures in these kegs. The keg was so hot that I could barely touch it for the first few hours. And I initially tried putting it in my chest freezer, but it just was emanating so much heat, it was just warming up the chest freezer. So I just left it in ambient room temperature for the rest of the day. Then overnight, I moved it into my chest freezer, set to just a few degrees above freezing. And then this morning, I touched it and it wasn't boiling hot anymore. So I opened it up and dropped a tilt hydrometer in there. And that told me that the temperature in here now is 62 degrees Fahrenheit or 17 Celsius. That's a little cooler than I was going for, but it's within the range of my yeast. So I'm going to pitch my yeast, which is Wyeast 1275. This is Thames Valley Ale yeast. Now, as the beer builds up pressure, we need to relieve that pressure somehow in the keg. I think the easiest way to do that is to sort of build an airlock by using a gas quick disconnect and then just putting the other end of this in some Star San, connecting this to the gas outpost and then just letting the CO2 bubble into here. However, I'm going to try pressure fermentation with this beer. Now, nothing crazy, but I'm going to ferment at about 15 psi, and that will have the added benefit of carbonating the beer while it's fermenting. So to do that, I'm going to use a spunding valve set to 15 psi. Now I'm going to employ a little trick that I learned from Brian from Short Circuited Brewers to prepare my serving keg. So I've got 2 kegs here. I've got the fermenting keg where the beer is right now, the serving keg where eventually I'm going to move the beer to. I put together a little jumper cable. This is connecting the quick disconnect here for the gas out of the fermenting keg to the liquid in of the serving keg. So as pressure builds during fermentation, it will be sent through this little jumper hose here down into my serving keg. That will push out any oxygen that's already in there, replacing it with CO2. And by adding this spunding valve here on the receiving keg, that will ensure that this whole setup is under 15 psi of pressure. It's been a couple of weeks now and this has worked out pretty well. The spunding valve kept everything at 15 psi and fermentation finished a little while ago, so it's now time to transfer from the fermenting keg into the serving keg. Now I'm switching around the jumper cables a little bit. I've changed this jumper cable to be gas to gas, and then I have a second jumper cable here which is liquid to liquid. And I'm going to start the transfer by simply reducing the pressure just slightly here in the receiving keg. The transfer is complete and I've opened up the fermenting keg, and there's a nice layer of trub at the bottom which I don't think has really got sucked up because of that clipped dip tube. Now the beer is fizzy and ready to drink right now, but I have put it in my keezer and I'm going to leave it to condition for a little bit longer and then give it a taste. One more stout, Lauren. One more stout for now.
Okay.
We've been through a lot of stouts.
Yeah, we have.
So we always look at the appearance and go, it's really dark. Let's have a look at the appearance. It's really dark.
It's really dark.
Yeah, okay. So let's see if we get anything from aroma on this one. Definitely a different aroma from last week's tropical stout.
I don't know if it's just me, but I don't really smell anything.
Exactly. I'm getting
Like,
virtually
nothing.
Like you could blindfold me and I wouldn't know there's a beer right beneath my nose. There is really not even any sort of roastiness.
There's no, yeah, malty, roasty, coffee, chocolate, nothing.
Okay, so aromaless and dark.
Okay.
See what we get with the taste.
It's quite tart, like taste-wise. I think it kind of lingers there, and I don't like that lingering. Like at the very end, and it kind of sits there. It's like, maybe it's because I don't like coffee and roasty things, because coffee always tastes quite tart to me.
Well, yeah, I'm not getting tart at all, but roasty for sure.
Yeah, so maybe that's the word. But
Yeah.
it's like,
This is, I think, of all the stouts we've done, to me, this is the roastiest that we've done. So
I didn't smell like it.
no, not at all, not at all. So roastiest for me and tartiest for you. Maybe that's, we're just picking up on
Right.
the same thing.
It's quite light feeling too, though, drink-wise. It's like some of the other ones have been kind of like heavier on the mouthfeel when you drink it. This one actually is like quite liquidy.
It's yeah, isn't it? It's sort of like mainly water.
You know what I'm saying? Like some of the other stouts have been like a little bit more of a thicker taste to it. This one is kind of...
So you think the mouth feels a bit thinner?
Yes.
Yeah.
Liquidy.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I'm also not really tasting the alcohol that I thought I would do at 7%. I thought maybe it would taste a little bit more alcoholic.
Yeah, that's true.
If we had to go back and look at the stouts that we've done, do you have a preference for the different stouts?
The oatmeal stout
Oatmeal stout?
was my... I think that lasted like 2.5 days. You went to the beach and it was gone.
Yeah, I came back to try the oatmeal stout again, see how it had aged after a good 3 days, and it had disappeared.
It was so good. I can't remember the other ones.
So we had Irish stout and Irish extra stout, which was served on nitro, if you remember that one.
Okay, I did like the extra stout. I probably would have gone oatmeal and then extra stout.
Yeah, for me it's kind of a tie between the Irish stout, I just really like dry Irish stout, and the tropical stout because it's just so different. It's something completely different.
The tropical one was definitely up there.
Well, we will revisit stouts on the Homebrew Challenge, don't you worry. But we are moving on to some strong English styles starting next week.
Okay.
Yeah, so until then,
Cheers.
cheers.